Let's take a look at a really solid looking class. I thought the Bengals did a good job. I forget what I gave them. I think I might have gave them somewhere, and I was doing it for another publication. I think I gave them somewhere on a B or a B plus. I
Oh,
think.
wow.
Yeah, uh, and a lot of that had to do with their first. Well, really, a lot of it had to do with most of their picks. I mean, Rivers is the only one and yeah, Fairchild, he was maybe drafted a little earlier than expected. But I think there's talent there. We'll start at the top. Let's start with the fact that we just talked about an edge rusher. So we knew no matter what Hendrickson, the whole situation with Hendrickson, they could have signed him to a 5-year deal before the draft, and they were still going to draft an edge rusher early, if not the first round. So I don't think this has anything to do with Henderson, in my opinion. I'm sure you might agree with that, but obviously it's that much more important now in case something happens to Hendrickson long term, where he's not around. But Shamar Stewart was the Ourlad's second-rated edge rusher. So obviously they got a good deal there. The kid is a physical kid. He's got a big upside. Good against the run, good against the pass. So, Bengals must have been very happy to get him where they did.
I think they were very happy. I agree to an extent. I think defensive line was definitely the target. Walter Nolan was, I think, the guy that they were going to take if he was there.
That's
and
true.
Of course, he was taken one spot ahead because they didn't sign or draft a pass rushing defensive tackle this entire offseason, and it's still a really big hole that he could have filled. They at least, re-signed Joseph Asai to a 1-year deal, and they expect Miles Murphy to play more along the edge. So I wasn't too expecting like it to be an edge or nothing necessarily at 17. I think the value in their eyes just kind of lined up, but I'm not as high on Shamar Stewart as I think other people are. I think not only the lack of production is concerning at the college level, is the fact that there was a lot of issues with this tape that kind of led with that production. And obviously, there's a lot of promise in the fact that he's only 21 years old. He's a freak athlete, and those freak athletes nowadays, they typically translate really well into just being solid players, right? But I think if you do have a top 20 pick, which, in the Bengals' eyes, they don't always want to be picking in the top 20 with Joe Burrow, it is a really good chance to draft someone that you think has a really good chance of being a really good player. And I'm just of the opinion that I don't think Stewart has a really good chance of being that caliber player because of a lot of things kind of working against him. And I think he has a lot to clean up with his game. And I think it would have really helped if Trey Hendrickson was participating in offseason workouts to kind of guide him along. And he's not even out there himself. Like, he hasn't even signed his rookie contract, so he's not practicing yet. He's not getting that valuable development time, and they need him to be an immediate contributor right now. And I don't know if I see that path necessarily in 2025.
Yeah, that's not what you want. I wasn't aware of that. Is he the only one rookie?
He's not the only one that's unsigned. We're going to talk about the other guy who's unsigned here in a minute, but he's the only one who's not practicing.
No one is not practicing. Yeah. Okay. I agree. I understand where you're coming from as far as because again, Ourlad's rating him. They've got the scouts. That's their deal. But I see what you see. I get it. I mean, I think the production is something that for the casual eye, that's what you want to see. And I think it is about what they may be able to get out of him than what he is right now. So I do agree with that. Was there an edge rusher if they chose an edge rusher? Or let's just say, Nolan was gone, so he wasn't even a factor. When you sat there and was waiting for them to take their first pick in the first round, did you have a player or two in mind?
When Nolan was gone, I thought Derek Harmon would have been a very logical pivot. He went obviously to the Pittsburgh Steelers a couple picks later, just because, again, like a really ready to go pass rusher who had proven it at the college level. He could prove that he could win and against really quality offensive linemen. I thought there were still some issues with Harmon's game. I'm not fully sold on him in terms of like being able to finish at the quarterback, which obviously very important. And obviously that's a really big concern with Stewart as well. So Stewart was just a guy that I think teams have fallen in love with in the past, and it doesn't always work out because like the traits don't always translate into actual success at the NFL level. So I think with edge rushers, like James Pierce was talked about as like a potential target for the Bengals, and he was obviously targeted really covetedly highly by the Falcons later in that round. Mike Green was also brought up, but he dropped all the way to the second round, so he wasn't, I guess, really in the conversation for the Bengals at all. So it was just a weird position, right? Because like there was obviously Abdul Carter at the top, and then Michael Williams went off the board with the 49ers, who also I think had similar concerns in terms of production with Stewart. So there wasn't really an edge that was like, yeah, like the Bengals should be all over this guy with the 17th pick. It was kind of a weird year for that position from where they were drafting.
Was there another position in mind? Like if they opted to go somewhere else?
Yeah,
Did you,
yeah, like Malachi Starks was talked about a lot, and he was
oh,
really highly touted with the
yes.
team. So if Stewart was off the board and Nolan was off the board, he was probably going to be that pick. And obviously they didn't do anything at safety. They still have Geno Stone. They gave him a pay cut, and that's clearly an indication that they didn't like what he did for them last year. So they were interested in trying to upgrade at that spot, and Malachi Starks was definitely an option there at 17.
Yeah, huge fan of Starks. I actually, in my mock draft, I actually had them going with a defensive back. I thought that would be what they would do based on how poorly their secondary had been over the last couple of seasons. And yes, you talked about Turner and Hill looked a lot better last year until their injuries, but still, just all you got to do is look at the depth chart right there for the R lads depth chart. There are no colors. And that means there's nothing new. So that's a little bit surprising. We'll get to that, I guess, a little bit later on. Okay. Second pick. They end up with our lad's top-rated linebacker, off-ball linebacker, Demetrius Knight Jr. And what's also good is that they come back in the fourth round and get Carter. And I bring that up because they're two kind of like what was missing from Knight was a little bit of, say, experience. But most importantly, it was more, I mean, not experience. It was really more of his lack of production as a cover linebacker. And then you get someone like Carter who comes in, and that's his biggest strength. So I like the fact that they were able to do that they were able to say, okay, well, Knight does a lot of this, but there's one thing we're not sure about, and he's got to take that next step to be a 3-down linebacker. But in the meantime, we got Barrett Carter. We know he can cover, so we're okay there. What did you think about adding both Demetrius Knight and Barrett Carter?
I thought it was interesting. It wasn't the position that I was expecting them to double dip, but
Yeah.
Al Golden, their new defense coordinator, he was the linebackers coach for them for a couple of years, so it's a position that he's very keen on, and he wanted to kind of rebuild the position group in his image. It definitely signals the end of Jermaine Pratt's time here. He's going to be a cap casualty if they can't find any sort of trade partner for him sometime this offseason. So Knight is projected to start next to Logan Wilson as kind of like that true weak side outside linebacker who can also maybe line up on the edge. That's how Al Golden kind of described him after making the pick. He sees him as having that kind of versatility where you can play him on and off the ball. And while Carter is more of like that true backup middle linebacker to Logan Wilson, who can still see the field in some sub packages and whatnot, because like you said, he's got 4-down ability. Really, he played a lot of special teams at Clemson as well, so they like his ability to kind of play in multiple different looks as well. And yeah, I think in terms of skill sets, like they complement each other really well, and they add a lot to the Bengals room. I like Knight being the best linebacker in the draft, I think speaks a lot to his tape. Like it was very promising in his 1 year at South Carolina. He did a lot of good things against really good competition. It's the fact for me that it's a top 50 pick spent on someone who's going to turn 25 years old in July. It's a questionable long-term decision to say the least, because you're talking about a guy who's going to be 29 by the time that he's going to be entering his second contract, and you question like the long-term, is it wise to spend a second round pick on someone that you may not expect to be here in 5 years? I don't
Sure.
know. It's part of the evaluation. It's part of like the process of grading the pick. But as a player, I agree. Like you're a really solid, promising player who doesn't really have a ton of deficiencies, despite the fact that he only started playing the position really a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and do you, so you think that primarily the way that they're going to scheme out their defense will stay the same, like with Pratt gone, Knight moving in, and Carter's basically the top third option. They're not going to, like, we're not going to see by midseason or the end of the season that they're going to have a lot of 3 linebacker sets.
It could happen more often. I mean, it's still the NFL. Like it's you're in nickel most of the time, anyways. Like what the Bengals tried to do under Lou Narumo, when teams would line up in kind of a heavy package or maybe in their base package with 12 personnel, that they would go in this 5-2 front or like a 3-4 type situation with 5 down linemen. I think the Bengals' new response to that could be a true 4-3 with, two linebackers flanking Logan Wilson, and those two linebackers could be Carter and Knight. They obviously signed Oren Burks in free agency, who's probably ahead of Carter, I would say, on the depth chart right now. But I think
Okay.
they want to get Knight on the field as soon as possible because at the end of the day, like that was still a surprising pick to a lot of people. He wasn't expected to go that early, maybe according to the consensus. So it's a bold decision, and I think they want to see the return on investment as soon as possible.
Okay. So then in between, they went with, and the rest of the picks are offense. So it started with guard Fairchild, and he doesn't have a lot of experience, but hey, he played Georgia football, so that's pretty up there. And the big question though was where they got him. I mean, our lads figured he'd be like a 5th or 6th round guy. The Bengals took him into 3rd, but again, not a lot of experience. So kind of different from what we just talked about with Knight. So here's a guy that they're going to be able to try to groom, and they feel pretty almost like Stewart too, that they feel is going to get better with more coaching, so forth and so on. So how surprising was that pick? Not that they picked a guard, but how surprising was it that was Fairchild in round 3?
Fairchild as a name, I don't think was surprising. He was linked to the Bengals somewhat often in the pre-draft process. And the 3rd round was a bit surprising, but I think kind of like what you were alluding to, like a guard was definitely a priority for them. And I think the fact that they left the first 2 rounds without addressing the position kind of lends to the fact that they needed to get one before, the 3rd day of the draft started. But Fairchild really impressed offensive line coach Scott Peters down at Georgia's Pro Day. Peters is renowned for coaching up pass protection techniques, particularly with hand usage. And he's the quintessential, like, give me the tools and I'll sculpt, David, out of clay. Right. And that I think that's what he sees from Fairchild. He kind of coined him as like the strongest player that he's ever really, been around in terms of that exposure, which is really high praise, obviously. But, Fairchild was known for being like a weight room warrior at Georgia. And like you said, being there for 4 years, despite only starting for 2 years, they always hammer on like the practices at Georgia are almost like as tough as the games themselves. That's why they prepare and they dominate so much in the SEC. And that was kind of the similar thing with Amarius Mims last year. Like he didn't play a lot for Georgia, but he was on the scout team. He practiced a ton and he got a lot of exposure against high-end athletes. And he was more prepared, I think, compared to other guys who only played, 800 snaps along the offensive line entering the NFL. And I think they kind of see a similar thing with Fairchild where, yeah, like in terms of the consensus, he wasn't rated that high, but as someone who didn't play a lot but can still be molded into a much better player than he is right now, they may see him as a value pick where like he probably would have went earlier than the 3rd round had he stayed another year, had another, solid year of film, and maybe would have been drafted higher. So that's at least their vision of him. And he is now tabbed to be the favorite to be the starting left guard, which again, maybe a little bit too early for him to see the field like that, but they're going to give him every chance in the world to start at that position.
So he never, when they played the Georgia together, they never lined up next to each other, as far as
Funny enough, they did actually, because Fairchild was left guard mostly, but he played right guard for the first 2 games of 2023, and that was right before Mims suffered his ankle injury that season. So they do have some experience, and they have a good relationship. Apparently, Amarius Mims gave him a nickname Pickle, like when they first came in together in 2021. So there's already that chemistry and camaraderie, which is kind of cool.
Okay. So you said left guard. Does that mean that you think that they believe that is his best position, or is it more of that's just based on who the veterans are there? We got Volson and Ford still there, or do you think it's going to be an open competition and they're going to put Fairchild in either spot? I mean, right now, would you pencil in Fairchild as a starter, or do you think it's open competition? Whoever's better is going to start.
I think it's a quote unquote competition. I think because you can't just hand Dylan Fairchild the starting job right away. But he's the favorite, and I think if he is just as good, obviously if not better than the other guys, then he will win that job. They're going to give him the chance to kind of grow with as many reps as possible. And because he played left guard mostly at Georgia, that's where they do see him at his best spot. Because again, like all the other guys on the team, like they have the ability to line up at right guard. They've taken snaps there before, so I think that's right guard is probably the position where it's more of an open competition.
Okay. Who do you think, by the way, is going to win that job between who's going to be the better veteran, Molson or Ford?
Lucas Patrick, I would say, actually, the guy that he signed from the Saints. Yeah, I think Ford, he was paid, I think, a little bit more than most expected because I think they still view him as having versatility to play tackle and we're going to talk about the guy who's going to be competing with him for that backup tackle spot. But I think he's probably viewed as like their best, first lineman off the bench type
Swing
of
tackle
player.
type or
And
swing
he,
lineman.
yeah, and he played left guard last year, but I don't think he was particularly, the guy that you want to just have just locked in at that spot. So I
Yeah,
think they're really
that's true.
comfortable with him as a backup who can also play tackle, which kind of increases his value a little bit. But Lucas Patrick, I think, has been the better starter when given the chances. When he's not playing center, center is like his worst spot in terms of where his film is. I think just when he's able to just play at guard, I think he's a decent, solid player who's a better athlete than Ford as well. So I think he has I think he's got a better chance of beating out Ford and Volson for that matter at that spot.
Okay. And now we go to the last pick, the other lineman picked, and that was Jalen Rivers. And Rivers, really, the main knock on Rivers is just his health, is staying healthy. But overall, you take a look at him. He's a versatile kid. Right now, we have him as the number 2 left tackle. Do the Bengals have a position in mind with Jalen Rivers? And was the injury bug kind of brought up at all?
It wasn't. I honestly wasn't really brought up that much when talking about him. Obviously, it's why he was there in the 5th round, because the tape is really clean. And had he stayed healthy and played, obviously, for a team that was in the spotlight last year for Miami, like I think he would have been drafted a lot earlier, even if he's not the best athlete. But someone who has this rare versatility, like to be able to play left tackle and left guard in the same games, like for 7 consecutive weeks, is almost unheard of. I don't know why Miami was having him do that, but it definitely stood out in the Bengals' eyes. And I think he's definitely good enough, I think, to compete to start at one of the guard spots. But considering the fact that they don't really have, outside of Cody Ford, they don't really have a reliable backup tackle, I think that's where his role makes sense. And plus, I don't know if you can count on him to start as a rookie if, like you said, he hasn't proven he can stay healthy for an entire season outside of just one, I think, at Miami. So having him as a backup to develop in that role, to give them some type of depth and size at the tackle spot, I think it makes a lot of sense. And they drafted him as a tackle, but they talked about him at guard, so I think he's going to cross train at multiple spots and just line up wherever he needs to be.
So it's possible that at some point later this year, because we'll give him a little bit of time, that if Volson or let's even just say Patrick or Ford, and they don't step up, that you could see Rivers and Fairchild starting at guard.
It's certainly not out of the question. Like, this offensive line is so far from being solidified to where it should be, and we've seen much crazier scenarios unfold.
Yes. Okay. Now we go to the last pick, and this is also an interesting one, and one that I really liked late in the draft. And I know, and again, these are the easier ones too for the casual fan, because anytime you can look at a skill position player, you look at the stats. And I'm sure there were a lot of fans that looked at Brooks's stats and thought, wow, I mean, this is a highly productive running back with good size who played in a big conference, produced. He showed the ability to break tackles. He showed the ability to catch the ball. So there is a lot to like. Now, obviously, when you put all that together and you're still basically barely getting drafted, there's issues there that some of the scouts, or a lot of the scouts, probably didn't like about Brooks. What did the Bengals like?
The ability to be a bowling ball with butcher blades is, I think, what his position coach at Texas Tech called him. Just having that size, the yards after contact ability, it's still something that the Bengals definitely value. Chase Brown is not, like, he's not as small as maybe people may think that he is, but he's definitely not, the size that Taj Brooks was at Texas Tech. And the consistency with his production. Obviously, Big 12 is not renowned for the defenses and everything like that, but he was always showing up. He was always staying healthy, taking care of his body, and I think he almost logged like 900 carries at Texas Tech, and he was still productive up until the very last year, which is why he's one of the most productive Big 12 running backs in the history of that conference. So the all-around ability, just being on the field for 3 downs, pass protecting is also something that they really value at that spot, and he did that really well at a high level and really often at Texas Tech. And it was a really stacked running back class, and I think the fact that he didn't look like the athlete that he may have tested at that size, I think that may have pushed him down some boards a little bit. So they saw him as a guy that probably should have been drafted, a round or two earlier, but to have all that production, to be adept in pass protection, so that he can contribute immediately over the likes of Samaje Perine or Zach Moss, I think that all kind of attracted them to him.
And if all goes well for Brooks, and we still don't know what Moss is going to do coming back from that injury. But that's also a likely scenario and I think one that most fans, and I even think the coaches have got to be looking at, that they would prefer, which is to have Brown and Brooks be the two guys that they count on the most. Brooks maybe short yardage, that kind of stuff, spell Chase Brown. Even though I know that they're hoping they can get something out of Zach Moss, and I completely get that. But yeah, I mean that's a lot to be excited about because we know what Chase Brown can do now. I mean, I think he proved enough to me. I mean, I had him on my fantasy team, so I was pretty happy. I bummed out that he wasn't on my dynasty team. But boy, did there was a lot to like about what we saw in Chase Brown at the end of the season last season. And if you compare him with a big guy like Brooks, there's a lot to like about that.
100%. The group at running back looks a lot better than it has in recent years, just from like a four player depth perspective. And like Moss and Piran, they don't have to be anything spectacular this year. I think they're just more of veterans that Brooks can look at and try to emulate as much as possible in training camp, so that he's able to earn trust of Joe Burrow and the offense to get on the field as the season does progress. Like with Chase Brown, even Joe Mixon back in 2017, like he didn't see the field all too often immediately as a rookie. It takes some time for these running backs to kind of earn trust within the offense. And now that you have established vets and P. Ryan, who obviously has leftover trust from his time with the Bengals previously, Zach Moss, who they clearly still wanted to be on the team. If not, they wouldn't have given him some guaranteed money with his pay cut that he took a couple weeks ago. And obviously Brown, who leads the group. So it's a really strong running back depth chart at this point, which is not something the Bengals could have said in years past.